Well, welcome. We're so pleased to have you here today for what is going to be a very lovely event. Before I begin my introduction, I have some thank yous. I want to first thank our senior minister, B. Janamanchi, who suggested today's speaker, which has turned out to be a wonderful suggestion. I'd like to thank Kathleen Reedy. Kathleen, would you stand up? Kathleen? There you go. For those of you who don't know why she's clapping, Kathleen has led a book discussion group discussing this book, and there's going to be one more opportunity if you didn't come, or if you haven't had a chance to read the book yet, this coming Thursday at 7 o'clock, 7:30. And oh, if you were in the book discussion group, she's asking, would you stand? And me too. Okay. So if you want a chance, and I suspect some of you will, to discuss the ideas that you're hearing today, you're welcome to come next Thursday. I want to thank my cohorts on the Kiplinger committee, Arthur Wilson, who will be helping with the Q&A and the book sale, and Rick Lohmeyer, who, as always, has helped tremendously with the AV, along with other things. The amazing Cedar Lane office staff, who are just always there for you, and so many people who have volunteered, setting up the reception, ushering, all of those who have come to help support and make this event happen. Thank you. Thank you so very much. We couldn't do it without you. In 2001, Cedar Lane UU Church received a grant from the Kiplinger Foundation in memory of Willard M. Kiplinger, who was a founding member of Cedar Lane. We have members today who still remember him. One of the purposes of this grant was to support an annual lecture to call attention to serious moral issues of our time. This is the 18th such lecture, and our speaker today embodies the ideals of this series. She has spent her life dealing with some of the most challenging ethical issues of our day. Frances Moore Lappé is the author of 19 books. She is co-founder of 3 national organizations, including the Small Planet Institute, that all work to resolve problems of hunger, poverty, and our environmental crisis. Her most recent book, Daring Democracy, Igniting Power, Meaning, and Connection for the America We Want. This book was chosen nationally by the Unitarian Universalist Association as the most important book for us to read this year. It examines the anti-democracy movement that has led to the election of Trump. It offers a wonderful call to action to save our democracy. I just want to say that at the conclusion of her talk, we are going to have a question and answer period, but in between, we'd like to give you all an opportunity to turn and talk to your neighbors for maybe 3 minutes, talk about what reached you most, what questions you still have, what you would like to know more. Then, if you do have a question, and I'm sure you've all been at a place where people get up and tell you their life story, so I'm going to ask you, please, just succinct questions. Thank you. And at the conclusion of the Q&A, we will be going in to have a lovely reception, and there are a number of Ms. Lappé's books there for sale, and she is willing to sign them. So I think I covered everything I need to cover here. So without further ado, our wonderful 18th annual Kiplinger speaker, Frances Moore Lappé.
Thank you, Jessica, Kathleen. I second all of those thank yous. This is an extraordinarily beautiful setting. I have been attending to every need, and I just couldn't be more grateful for being here. I want to introduce myself a little bit more to you by explaining that when I marched, and this is going to come up in my talk, but I marched from Philadelphia to Washington 2 years ago with Democracy Spring for democracy reforms. And I found that as I marched, you know, you walk and you meet new people, and I came up with an idea, and I said, oh, I'll just tell you one sentence about me, and that's all you need to know. It made it very simple. And it relates to you all, too. We have a connection. This was my sentence. I am the daughter of Ina and John Moore, who founded the First Unitarian Church of Fort Worth and integrated it before the city was desegregated. So that's all you need to know. And I want to tell you, though, a little bit of family lore about the founding of the church. It goes like this. Francie, that was my childhood nickname, Francie came home from going to Sunday school with her neighbor, little 4-year-old neighbor, and she came in and she said, Mommy, Daddy, what does hellfire and brimstone mean? And my mom and dad looked at each other and said, it means we have to start a Unitarian church. So I can't guarantee the truth of that story, but I'd love to tell the story. You can see here on the screen this quote that I love about democracy. You can say that democracy is my daily prayer. It is, that will make that very clear as I go. But this idea that Hastie is getting at here, the first African-American federal judge, is that democracy is a journey. It is not a landing point. We never get there, folks. It is the essence of the human journey in many ways. And my theme here is that in this, we have to, on this journey, it requires something very important in us, that we recognize that it is a long journey, and it is an important, grounding for the message of hope in my talk. But I want to start us because I believe that, you know, democracy is all about hope, and we hear the phrase "hope springs eternal," but we have to dig for that spring. And so the first part of my talk is really digging for the stream, and that means digging for the root causes. So I want to put up on the screen next some very sobering findings that I just ran across in the last couple of weeks. And get ready. This is pretty disturbing. Integrity Project, and they have observers around the world that judge electoral integrity on 11 measures. And it turns out that of 158 countries that we're 55th in the neighborhood of Oman and Panama. On economic inequality, you know, I hear people say, oh, we're worse than Western Europe, but that's not the half of it. You see those numbers are quite alarming, that there are 100 countries in the world that are doing better than we are in resisting extreme inequality. We rank in the neighborhood of Turkey and Uganda. Shocking statistics that homicide deaths by guns are 25-fold compared to other high-income countries. So why do I start with this awful news? I start with it because I think we have to dig to the roots of a problem if we are truly going to cultivate what I call honest hope, eyes wide open hope, hope that can truly sustain us. And so first, I want to, just on this bad news, is to point out two things that help me a lot. And that is, imagine if we knew how bad things are for people in this country, and also we rate it as a great democracy. That would be really depressing, right? If somebody told us, oh yeah, your democracy's great, but then what do we do? So I find it actually, it's shocking, but it's a relief to me that by many measures other countries are doing better, many of them are, and therefore we have a lot that we can learn. And my second thought, and it's still this notion of experiencing hope, key to experiencing hope, is that facing these hard truths is absolutely essential. We have no choice. And when I say we have no choice, it is this, is that I've come to see that hope itself is a source of power, that hope actually reorganizes our brains toward solutions. So it's not for wimps, because we've got to do this hard work to get that kind of hope. We have to face how bad things are. And so, yes, I do believe that hope has power. Hope has power. So here's then the question. To go to the root. Oh yeah, that's great. None of us would go for that. So how is it that we're creating a world together that as individuals we abhor? And so I had this hunch some many decades ago, and my hypothesis then became that what is unique about us, that's what we should be looking at. What's unique about the human species? And certainly one, if not the most distinguishing feature, is that we are creatures of the mind. We are creatures of the mind. In other words, the power of ideas is enormous in determining outcomes for our species. I think Aldous Huxley, combined with Albert Einstein, all that we are and will and do depends in the last analysis on what we believe the nature of things to be. And then Einstein, very simply, it is theory which decides what we can observe. So it's very hard for us to even see what is outside of our culturally formed mental map. And that's really the thesis of a lot of my work now, that what is that mental map? What is that cultural filter? Because, of course, seeing through a filter, having your hypothesis limit your vision is not a bad thing if it fundamentally is life-serving. But I've come to see that actually you and I are alive at a time when the dominant mental map, this cultural filter, is actually life-destroying, because it is perversely aligned with our very nature. And that's the case I'm going to make before I get into the good news of what is emerging that is aligned. And so I've reduced this worldview that I'm saying is our mental map that's doing us in. I've reduced it to a spiral I call the spiral of powerlessness. And it starts with fear. It starts with the fear of lack, that there's not enough of anything. There's not enough goods, and I mean the most broad sense of energy and food, etc., land, whatever it is. And there's not enough goodness in us. That if you peel away the fluff from human nature, all you can really count on is that we are selfish, materialistic, and competitive. Yeah. And if you believe that about ourselves, that we're these little isolated atoms, then of course you can't trust yourself, your neighbor, and government to come together and work for the general welfare, of course, which is in the preamble to our Constitution, the common good. So what do you do if you can't trust human nature? You look for some alternative. You look for some infallible law that's going to sort things out for us because we're too impaired. And Ronald Reagan named it. the magic of the marketplace. Now with magic, we don't look behind the curtain, right? We just trust it. And it sorts out winners and losers because it's infallible. We just trust that market force. Let everything possible become a commodity and sort it out that way. Now, what happens? What happens? This is where we are here, this market that we're told is free, but of course, there is no such thing. All markets have rules. And we have one kind of invisible rule that drives just about everything, and that is that you make decisions on what brings highest return to existing wealth. So wealth accrues to wealth, accrues to wealth, so much so that today, 3 Americans control as much wealth as the bottom half of our population. So then, of course, that concentrated wealth infuses, infects, and distorts our political system in its benefit, and the outcome absolutely reinforces our premise, because the outcome is that people actually experience scarcity. And so this premise of scarcity gets reinforced. And the premise that we're just these slimy, greedy, little self-seeking critters gets reinforced too when we see homelessness increasing and we see people callously walking by the suffering, both literally and figuratively. So I'm saying that this spiral of powerlessness then leads to a culture of shame and blame that is now being played out very much in the narrative that the president today is articulating. But the shame and blame helps me understand why people would vote for a Donald Trump, because they feel so shamed by the system and are taught, therefore, when we feel shame, it's very easy to blame. So this blame and shame culture is a big discussion that I hope that we can get into. But the question is then, really how do we go forward? How do we go forward? Is democracy even possible? Because yes, I'm saying that it is this false frame about who we are that leads us to actually reinforce the fear of lack in ourselves and lack in nature. But let me come at this from another angle to ask, is democracy even possible? And I want to say that indeed, if despite that downward spiral that we can get in from these assumptions about ourselves, that actually, contrary to the premise of the spiral of powerlessness, we also know that human beings have enormous capacities for these 3 qualities. We experience them every day in our lives. So a sense of fairness. Did you ever hear about the study that was done with the Capuchin monkeys? Then they were fine with their little ration of cucumbers or something until their neighbor in the next cage actually got some kind of raisin or grape or something, and that was tastier. And so the Capuchin monkeys, who were just getting the less tasty treat, just threw it back at the caretaker and said, no thanks. So it's not just our species, but certainly we have, as Adam Smith wrote in The Theory of Moral Sentiments, the human beings are some way tied, bound, and obliged to the observation of justice, that it runs deep in us. So we have that sense of fairness. We can also count on empathy, that our babies, human babies, cry at the sound of other babies cry, but not at their own, that deeply, deeply in us. And we also enjoy cooperation. Studies have been done where they're looking at our brains respond when we compete and when we cooperate. And it turns out that cooperation stimulates the reward centers similar to eating chocolate. So I kind of like that. So yes, so despite the spiral we're going down, that's based on a very different premise, we have these capacities, and because this is who we are, then we also have 3 deep needs that only democratic governance can meet. And this is my other strong hunch, is that, we have what I call the sense of these central needs for thriving involve power, that is a sense of agency, that we need meaning in our lives beyond our own survival, and connection. And I think that's a pretty good definition of what we mean by human dignity itself. And so my case is that only democracy can meet those needs that human beings share. And that we've been shown over our long evolution now that there are certain conditions that meet those deep needs and that are defining of, therefore, democracy bringing out the best in us. And those three conditions then that are proven to bring out the best, and for me define democracy, or what I love to call living democracy, are the distributed and inclusive power, transparency in public affairs, and the notion not of blame, 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 but of mutual accountability. For example, when after the Wall Street meltdown, I agree that some bankers should have gone to jail, but I also think I have to look at myself. Where was I when Bill Clinton was deregulating the financial industry? That as citizens, we were asleep. And we also have to take some modicum of responsibility so we can not just be blamers, as Alexander Joshua Heschel, rabbi, said, some are guilty, but we're all responsible. So that's the idea of mutual accountability. So I'm going through this to make my case that democracy is not a choice. It is the only pathway, it is the only approach to government that meets these needs, that can reverse that spiral of powerlessness, that creates the conditions that bring forth the best in us. And we know that the opposite of those three conditions, that is, the opposite of distributed power, concentrated power, and the opposite of those other conditions has shown throughout history to bring forth some very ugly dimensions to us. So the good news is that we see here then that what is happening is that, oh, sorry, what happened here? Oh, okay, I see. So that, again, before we, I'm doing this dance between the problem and the solution. So before I talked about, the problem of the symptoms of the breakdown in our electoral democracy and the extreme inequality that has arisen, I made the case that, yes, democracy is essential. And so before we get to the emergence of a response that is truly aligned with our nature, I want to point out that the spiral of powerlessness is driven today by a very deliberate anti-democracy movement that is creating some very negative conditions, the very conditions here that bring out the very worst in us. And Adam and I, in Daring Democracy, like to call this movement the anti-democracy movement. We want to make clear that we're not making a case about evil people. We are making a case about people with tremendous power, and I'm going to explain that, who have put forth very deliberate strategies, very successful strategies that are, in fact, increasing the concentration of power and increasing secrecy and increasing a blaming culture. So we call it the anti-democracy movement and summarize it in these 8 strategies. So I wanted to explain this movement that is what we in the democracy movement then are challenging and transforming is, I want to take you back actually to the year that Diet for a Small Planet was published, and 1971. That to understand what's happened to us, this rising anti-democracy path that we have been on, we have to go back to 1971. Because that was after the decade of the 60s, in which a lot of things that I was part of the war on poverty, for example, the women's movement was alive, the growth of the burst of the environmental consciousness, 20 million people turned out for Earth Day, the EPA was formed. All of that, a lot of people were celebrating. But in 1971, there was a corporate lawyer named Lewis Powell who was very, very concerned, very concerned. He was just about to be appointed a Supreme Court justice. And he was asked by the Chamber of Commerce if he would write something that would give corporate America a way to confront the challenge that had come on them with all that was happening in the 60s, where people were finding their voices. And so he wrote a memo, a 34-page memo that's very easy to find online. Just Google the Powell memo, and in which he obviously was sincerely concerned about threats to the free enterprise system. And he said the hour is late, we are in deep trouble, and that people, including Ralph Nader, he singled out, want to destroy the free enterprise system. And so with business under siege, it felt like a life and death struggle. And how do we succeed to put forward a business point of view, because businessmen are no longer being listened to? And so what Adam and I do in Daring Democracy is describe these very, very successful strategies that they came up with. And the first category we call manipulating the mindset. Just how do we get the idea going that the free enterprise system, basically unleashing the market and keeping the government out of the way, is the answer. And so from grade school to grad school, they made grants and looked at textbooks and advised on that. The Koch brothers alone funded 200 campuses in just 1 year. The Olin family, from the chemical industry, underwrote the birth of a whole new piece of economic departments called Law and Economics, the theme of which is to teach the value of reducing social goods to commodity transactions. So the privatization of prisons makes a perfect example of that success. And then another part of the manipulating the mindset is to scale up think tanks, So Heritage, for example, the Heritage Foundation, during the Reagan years, it produced a playbook of policies, about 1,300 policies, and the Reagan administration adopted 61% of them. And perhaps the most destructive aspect of this approach was to work to delegitimize government itself. And one way to do that, of course, is to make it less functional by using the filibuster more. And if that's not enough, to cause government shutdowns, as happened in 2013, that cost the American taxpayer $24 billion. But it's also just delegitimizing government by making it really nasty. So we quote a speech by Newt Gingrich in the 1980s in which he said, what we've got to do here, we are in a war, and we've got to fight this war with the scale and duration and savagery of civil war. So you don't see your opponents, the Democrats, as legitimate contributors to a dialogue. You see them as the enemy to be destroyed. And so this nastiness element and disrespectful element was definitely encouraged. Another critical piece of this anti-democracy movement is simply the way that handfuls of billionaires' families have created powerful influence outside of the party structure. Harvard scholars have estimated that 70% now of resources on the right are outside of the party structure, so they're even less visible, less accountable. And also what we call AstroTurf funding of things that look like grassroots spontaneous explosions of energy are actually funded. For example, the Tea Party got a lot of support from the Kochs. And finally, there's been a very deliberate, very smart coordination of efforts. So the Koch brothers, biannually, they have a big meeting in which you have to put $100,000 to get in the door, but then you coordinate strategies to be more effective. So that is part of what we have described. But then we've also described what was so shocking to us is actually how the rules had been rigged. And what we mean by that is that money in politics, unleashing the power of money in politics, so that in our last election, almost $6.5 billion was spent, but 1/2 of 1% contributed 2/3 of that. And even in what I naively thought, with the Supreme Court decision of Citizens United that unleashed private money, that made the way then with another ruling, made the way for big super PAC money to come in, I sort of thought, oh, that Citizens United case, that started, with some aggrieved person, and it just kind of rose to the top because that's what the courts were deciding was important. But I didn't know until doing research for the book that the Amway money, the billionaire family, the DeVos family, you may have heard of Betsy DeVos, Secretary of Agriculture, that they're the ones who funded the Madison Center to push that Citizens United case all the way up until this ruling that 80% of Americans disagree with. So even that wasn't spontaneous in a sense. It was very deliberately planned and carried through. Another piece of rigging the rules is lobbyists have increased in the first, I believe it was 11 years of the after the Powell memo. The number of firms with lobbyists increased 14-fold. And another piece of this is that the recruitment of former Congresspeople to be lobbyists, about 3%, in 1971, only about 3% of Congress people when they left office would become a lobbyist. But now, the last time I looked, it was about half of all legislators in Washington. And the nature of lobbying changed as well, as instead of simply nabbing the legislator you want to influence, in the lobby, which was the origin of the term, that lobbyists are now involved in the very drafting of legislation, including the kinds of legislation that involve suppressing the vote. For example, by 2017, 34 states had some form of voter ID requirement. So the lobbying then became drafting of laws, often those that are directly related to suppressing the vote of people who would be most hurt by the kinds of policies that were being pursued. And another piece of this is the rigging of district lines. I just learned from this electoral integrity project that now the U.S., in terms of the extreme gerrymandering going on, we are next to the worst in the entire world. Only Malaysia is worse than us. So this is no small matter. This rigging of the rules and the gerrymandering piece, of course, is made much more severe through the new big data tools that are now available. So all of this is a scary part, but my thesis is that hope depends on our willingness to look into both the mindset, this scarcity scare that leads to the powerlessness spiral, and to the deliberate efforts to foment that worldview, one that's based on this competition through the market, that the government is the enemy and the common good is a myth. So it is, as we face this, then we can see more clearly what we need to do. And so I just want to literally and figuratively take a deep breath and realize that actually it is not the magnitude, and I agree, this is a magnitude, enormous magnitude, the challenge before us. But I argue that it is not the magnitude of a challenge that crushes the human spirit. The only thing that does us in is feeling futile, feeling useless, feeling there's nothing that we can do. Because I am convinced, if you look back at our history, that when human beings feel something is absolutely essential, I've argued today that democracy is absolutely essential, when it is possible, we don't have to believe it's probable, but if it's possible, and if we could each of us see a place for ourselves in making a difference, then we can sometimes do what seems to be absolutely beyond us. And so I have to say that for me, we are at this moment where this is the insight that that actually keeps me going more than anything, because for the first time in my life, now my long life, is that I believe that something strong enough to enable each of us to meet this number three here, that we can each make a difference, for the first time in my life is emerging. And I feel that from what I've learned about your congregation, that you are already part of it. And that's why I'm so honored and thrilled to be here. And what I mean is that for the first time in my life, there is actually a growing democracy movement. And when I say, don't I look happy? I had just said to Adam, I said, I think this is the happiest day of my life. And of course, I meant my public life, but we had just marched from Philadelphia to Washington on behalf of democracy. And I'm going to come to this again. We had just marched that distance, and what was so amazing about it is that there were more than 100 organizations that were signed on as supporters of our march. That was beautiful. And by the way, we stayed in a lot of UU churches on the church floor with wonderful meals created by the community of UU. And so, forever grateful for that. And then, when we got to Washington, we were met by another coalition, even bigger, called Democracy Awakening. And together, 1,300 people got arrested on the Capitol steps for democracy, for money out of politics and voting reforms. And it's certainly one of the largest sit-ins ever on the Capitol steps. And so what is additionally so exciting to me is that this actually is a movement of movements. And that's when I really emphasize, I want to underscore how amazing this is, that people from the peace movement, from the environmental movement, from the racial justice movement, from the labor movement, on and on and on, they've come together to create a unified movement of movements we call it the democracy movement. So that now there is an organization, Democracy Initiative, representing 63 organizations, all of those that I just mentioned represented, and their membership represents 40 million Americans, all committed, understanding that we can't make progress, real progress on the environment or against poverty without democracy. So a friend of ours that represented us, the founder of Represent Us, he said to me, Frankie, you know, you can love two children at once. And I have two kids, I get it. What he was getting at is that I don't have to give up my passion for food and agricultural issues and concerns there in order to be part of the democracy movement. So whatever our individual issue passions are, we can take part also in this. And one of the greatest things is that despite all the rhetoric about polarize, there is tremendous unity in this country. Look at those statistics. I mean, certainly, I don't see those kind of numbers, and we've got to keep them and share them with others, that 85% of us, we know there's too much money in our political system. 82% of us 82% of us think the wealthy have too much power in Washington. 85% want a major change in the way we finance elections to get that big money out or drastically reduce it. And then even on the specifics of public financing, there's tremendous agreement. And so we have a lot to build on. And so what this democracy movement then is beginning to build is in at least 3 areas of money out of politics, of restoring and expanding voting rights, and ensuring that every vote has equal weight. So I want to just start with just a couple of examples of what we mean by the nitty-gritty of the democracy movement in clean elections. There are now about 13 states that have some kind of clean elections, meaning that public financing and done in different ways. And I know that a lot of people celebrated in 2014 when Maryland, Montgomery County Council adopted a small donor matching fund for county council and the county executives. And in two states, in very extensive ways, public financing is working. And one of them I want to take us to, that I've been so inspired to, is the state of Maine. I just quickly want to take us to Maine, because there in 1996, they had this idea that there was a big crisis, deaths by truckers. It's a complicated story, I won't tell you, but anyway, people were really upset with the power of private money in the political system. And so they said, okay, we're going to have a matching fund system, so all you have to do is get $5 from 50 people and you can run for office, because you can get public money enough to finance your campaign. And they wanted to hire a polling company to see if it would pass. And the polling company refused to take their money. They said it would be unethical because there's no way this can possibly pass. And the Mainers kept going. And so it passed with 12% margin. And by the time it got underway, people like my hero, Deb Simpson. Deb was a waitress in a small town in rural Maine. And her friends saw leadership in her. And they said, Deb, you should run for office. And she said, what are you talking about? I don't have money. And when she found out she only had to get $5 from 50 people to make herself a credible candidate, she said, oh, I'm a waitress. I can do this. And she did it. And look at this record. You know, she I believe doesn't have a college degree. She was brilliant with great natural leadership qualities. They put her in the charge of committees, and she was reelected 4 times. So this is what can happen. This is the kind of hidden talent that we can see when democracy is really working. And one of the outcomes then is that in Maine today, it has the largest percentage of working class people in the state legislature of any state, and that in policies, you can't prove cause and effect, but for example, after this system went into effect, that Maine passed a producer responsibility law so that companies that made electronic equipment had to take responsibility for the full life cycle, and that I believe it's just in the first year it kept like a pound of lead out of the Maine landscape for every person in the state. And that kind of breakthrough, which had been resisted by corporate power before public financing. So another example that inspires us is what happened in in Seattle, with a system for a couple of offices, including the city council, where I think it's really a smart way to do it. You could think of it as democracy vouchers. Everybody in Seattle got 4 $25 vouchers that they could give to any candidate they wanted. And it worked. When we were out there on our book tour, people were so excited about it. And what happened is a lot more young people participated as donors, of course, because they could. And there was a lot more conversation about where they're going to allocate their vouchers, and there was a better demographic distribution overall of people participating, and they were delighted at how it was working. Another key part of democracy is creating automatic voter registration, and on that score, Oregon was the leader, and it was an amazing story, within the first 3 months of automatic voter registration, there was a tripling in the number of people being registered, and the first vote after they're using the system, meaning that anytime you have a connection like the DMV, et cetera, you're automatically enrolled, and you can decline, you can withdraw, but you automatically are registered. And so they had something close to 100,000 new voters. And then, with the speed of, in terms of social change, a very speedy process, 10 states and the District of Columbia have automatic voter registration. Also, I mentioned how bad we are on the gerrymandering. And so I just wanted to jump to this is, automatic voter registration here. I wanted to mention, I forgot about this. This is really important. Restoring felons' voting rights. I read about a woman in Virginia who had stolen diapers for her newborn when she was 19 years old. and she could not vote for her entire life because she had a felony conviction. So in Florida, you see the numbers here, more than 1.5 million Floridians have now not the capacity to vote, not allowed to vote because they have a felony record. And so there's been a big campaign over this last year, and they had to get 770,000 signatures to put this on the ballot next year, and they got there. They got there. And you know, we know that people who vote, people who have their dignity restored in a sense that way, have less recidivism. It's a win-win for society and for them. And so if you know anybody in Florida, that is a very big step, and throughout the country, that is a very, very important step. So then I jumped the gun here, then to gerrymandering reform. I put all those steps on a slide just to make a point that Californians take their democracy very seriously as we end up here. That they developed a system, went through all these steps, and guess what? The last step, there is like, you've been to bingo games where there's a tumbler and then you pull a ping pong ball out to see who's in it. Well, I love it. It can't be hacked, right? Or at least not, I guess it could be hacked. Anything can be hacked. But the point is that they've gone to all these lengths to make their new districting commission totally, you know, impartial and representative of the country. And so I got to sit in on a panel of these folks who were chosen for this electoral commission. And then they explained how they set up 100 meetings around the country, around California, listening sessions, feedback sessions, so that the citizens could then weigh in on whether they thought the new lines being drawn for their districts were fair. And we actually met somebody who'd participated, and he said, you know, I said, no, I don't think that's right. That doesn't work for my community. They flashed up on the screen what this gentleman was recommending, and he persuaded the commission to go with his lines, where he would draw the lines. So it was really working. So when I think about we're the worst in the world except for Malaysia, I just want to remind us that there are now a number of states stepping up, and certainly what California has just been through is something that I think we can all learn from. Now, the theme of this democracy challenge, saying democracy is not a choice, it is essential. It can almost feel like some duty that is like the spinach we have to eat to get our deserts of personal freedom, and we have to buck up and do this and be a good doobie. And I found, and you saw the joy in my face in that march, that in fact, what we're really talking about here is something that we call the thrill of democracy. That I think of it as a shift, an internal shift that certainly Adam and I experienced during that march, that is the antidote to the hopelessness, the antidote to the sense of lack of possibility that so many feel. And we described it, this shift that took place, as three like seismic changes in our consciousness. And one of them was simply that we weren't so alone as we thought. Marching from Philadelphia to DC, I met, Iraq vets and a teenager from California and a lawyer from Menlo Park, California. I met people I would never have met otherwise. And just when you step outside of your circles and you meet people who are aligned and understand that democracy, you may disagree with other things, but you're totally devoted to democracy, I found that just so strengthening internally. And also, when we were approaching the Capitol that morning, we were chanting, "Whose democracy? Our democracy. Whose democracy? Our democracy." And just as we were chanting that, the dome of the Capitol came into focus for me. And I found that I was just bawling. And I was thinking, what is going on here? And Adam was going through this emotional shift too. And it was like I could feel this little in my brain trying to reorganize. And what it was. When I saw the dome and we were chanting that, I said, oh yeah, 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 they work for me, they work for me. This is my democracy, the people in, in those august buildings. And that shift from feeling powerless, I'm just a citizen, to feeling like, wait, but the citizens are in charge in a democracy. You realize that in our duties, as our responsibilities as a citizen, is where our power lies. And this sense of empowerment just welled up in me. And that then is connected to the final feeling we have. We realized, first of all, I didn't think I could walk 10 miles, to tell you the truth. And so we discover that when we do what we thought we could not do, it means we think, oh, the next thing, the next thing, the next thing. And so that sense of civil courage starts to grow that then really makes it possible for us to be owners of our democracy, to be in charge. And so that makes possible then that sense of empowerment, that sense of civil courage, that sense we're not alone, makes possible this. It is the opposite of the powerlessness spiral. It is a spiral of empowerment, which begins with that sense that it is ours, this democracy is ours. And as I pointed out earlier, that we have the capacities necessary for democracy if we create the conditions that bring them out. And so what do we do? We start with that assumption that we have the capacities, and then we have to focus on what are the rules and norms that bring out those qualities in us. I've already claimed they are dispersion of power, transparency, and mutual accountability, not the blame game. So we know what to do. Then we believe that this democracy, it makes it possible to believe that this democracy movement can actually succeed in freeing us from our political system from the grip of private power, and that we can create a market that's fair and open because the rules are set in a democratic way, not by private interests. And then that creates this virtuous cycle of empowerment, because then we start trusting ourselves more and move away from this idea of the blame and shame into our own sense of our own capacities. So that is really the if you will, the reward for all of this hard work of facing how, not only how entrenched our problems are, how we rate in the world that's really, really embarrassing, and we have to admit how this has been constructed without our, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but those 8 strategies, that's the public record. That this polarization didn't just happen spontaneously, it has been constructed. So if we are willing then to face all of that, we can create this spiral of empowerment, because we're willing to look at the dark side, to look into the dark roots, and as I said earlier, hope springs eternal, but we have to dig for that spring to keep it open. And so one of the things I wanted to point out to you before I close is just that this is the beginning of my dream that Small Planet, My Little Institute, and this large organization, Democracy Initiative, we're working to create one website where no matter what your interest is in democracy in America, that you could jump there. It would welcome you in a really cool way. It's not there yet, but have hope. And that you could then find somebody, you want a democracy buddy, you're just a newbie and you want to get involved, you want somebody to partner with you right here in your community, and you could send your information, hook up that way. You could get connected with organizations here in Maryland that are working on the particular issues that you think are most important, and you could see videos of testimonials of people who are out there doing this great work. So that's called the Field Guide to the Democracy Movement. And so we hope that you'll remember that, you'll give us ideas. We're not there yet, but it's up. This field guide is up, but it's just not as engaging as I want it to be, and I know it can be, and we will make it with your help. So, in closing, what I wanted to share with you is that in this very challenging moment, we do not have to be optimists. We do not have to be optimists, but we do have to cultivate possibilism. We do have to be possibilists, meaning that change is the nature of life, is part of the service this morning emphasized, and therefore it's not possible to know what's possible. And we now know from other countries, from our own history, from what we know about human nature, that humans can do democracy if we get serious about it. And so I guess you could say for me, it's almost as if democracy is the practice of enabling human dignity. And that is, I can think of no higher calling. And so I've end with this, which is on our website that my daughter and I created for our organization as we traveled the world and met people who were facing the biggest obstacles, and yet they were the most hopeful. And we came home, we looked at each other, and we said, oh, we get it. That hope is not what we seek out there in evidence, it is what we become in action together. And that is why I am so, so grateful to be in this community today, because all of I've learned in the hours I've been here this morning, you get this, you get it, and I just want to encourage you to go for it. Thank you. Oh, yeah. My job was to remind you now, if you would just turn to your neighbor and what you disagree, what you didn't get, what made you most, anything that would get you into conversation together. And if you have a question for me, that's great. That might spark your question. You could come up with one together or not. But just to get you thinking about what you heard critically, what worked for you, what didn't, whatever you want to share with one another, just 3 minutes.
3 minutes is all you guys to talk quickly. I know you can do that.
And thank you.
How to get this
Okay, I know you're having some great discussions, and we can continue the discussions after the question and answer time in our fellowship hall, but I'd like to call your attention back up here, please. Arthur is over by the microphone, and if you have some further questions that you'd like to address right now, let's see if we can keep this to 15 minutes, so keep those questions succinct, and then there will be a book signing and a reception where we can do more of this great talking. So line up if you have a question. Come on over here. We're going to do that rather than pass the mic, okay?
And of all of you, I don't need that, right? All of you who are like me and might be able to give a talk, but you can't ask, your heart starts pounding when you ask a question. I have a cheesy trick that I forgot to mention when I was talking about courage. And my heart goes, blah, 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 and I used to always say, Frankie, you wimp, get over it, just do it. And then I said, oh, you're the reframer, you got to reframe that. So the pounding heart you may be feeling when you're trying to decide whether to get over here, just think of it as your inner applause.
Thank you. My name is Duncan Ferguson. I'm inner applauding a lot right now.
Okay.
So I applaud you. I think that the 85% that you had up there,
yes.
So if we think of that statistically, to me that means that more than 50% of Republicans believe in that. So my question for you, and frankly for all of us, is how do we bring them into the conversation? Because I think we're at a point in time now where we can't do it without them.
I agree, and that is my mission going forward. And I think one of the things, I don't have all, I mean, I agree completely in terms of how to operationalize that. I started with my brother who grew up in that same church I did. Didn't work at all. He won't talk to me at all about politics. But I think that I really do feel that there are, and this is kind of the next stage after this book tour effort, of neutral environments where we can point out how much we agree on. And I think all of us, if we could participate in countering anybody who says, oh, we're so polarized, to point out the kind of unity we have. And by the way, in our book, we have a number of, not just these process unities, but also issue unity. There's tremendous agreement on, even on things like climate change, much more agreement than the popular media would have you believe. And so just counter, if somebody just talks, you say, wait a minute, yes, in some ways yes, in some ways no, because there's so much agreement, but we don't have the forms. The social media has picked up this whole theme of tribalism, and also point out that some of that is just being manufactured. And that is what we tried to bring out in the 8 strategies. We called it 8 strategies of highly effective billionaires. So, it's both that to convince ourselves, all I know is it's the right question. It's a question I'm asking, and I'd like to be in touch. And also, if there are others who are involved in listening to others, listening to people who voted for Trump, because I do know now that the latest polls that I saw, that there was a real shift in loss of support for him as the person. And if we can then figure out better ways, and certainly we failed in the last election to communicate how we stood for the working people, we meaning however we want to define us, but the Democratic Party, if you read the party platform, it is magnificent on democracy issues and on real issues like minimum wage and and support and removing the attack on unions, etc. So we've got to get better at making clear that we are standing for people now who are being disadvantaged, and that's what I really want to do. So maybe there are others who have a better answer, and I'd like to hear. But thank you for asking that critical question.
Okay, thank you. I'll approach you at the signing table.
Great, thank you.
Yes, I'm a person who's already involved, and we have opportunities. We've got elections going on, so people can support their candidates. We've got a huge number of people on the ballot just running for county council at large in Montgomery County. But the other thing is what's going on in Annapolis. And there are bills, I mean, as we speak, there's this short session in the legislature, just a few months, where laws are passed, and sometimes they deal with things like the prison issues, and well, in Maryland we have some marriage equality was passed, and a lot of good things have happened. But I also find there's a culture in Annapolis which bothers me, which is that people get along to go along with committee chairs, and the utilities, such as the electric utilities, have power at the committee level. And sometimes a very good bill simply won't get passed because everyone feels they have to go along with the committee chair, and everyone on that committee, if they're not taking money from the utilities, they're under the influence of the committee chair and other people who are. So how do you deal with that situation?
Well, I think that the more people, what would help, I think, if you share with everyone, you know, what you think is the most important organization to connect with on exactly how did you become so well informed that others would want to become as well informed as you? Because I think it can only change as people stand up and say, no, if you continue that behavior, we're not re-electing you. So do you have a recommendation for all the local people?
I got involved in that particular issue because I'm fighting smart meter opt-out fees, which a lot of people don't know about because they have a smart meter. You know, some of us have our analog meters because the meters, you know, create privacy issues, possible health issues with electromagnetic radiation, although it may not be proven. But, you know, there are people who are extra sensitive, so there is this health concern. And we have a right under Maryland law to opt out, but the utilities can charge these humongous fees, like $75 plus $14 a month if you decide you want to keep your analog meter. That's the one issue. It's below the radar screen, but it's gotten me involved. And that's how I became aware of this whole problem of the culture and the committee chairs having so much control and being under the influence of the utilities. So, I mean, I could go on at length, but I want to give other people a chance.
Yeah, okay. But yeah, great. I just wanted to mention Common Cause Maryland is an organization that works on some of these basic democracy reforms which don't directly address what you're talking about, but they do in a way, because as we get more transparency, more citizens involved, more watching of that, then, you know, politicians can't ignore us, you know, the more of us are speaking out. So Common Cause Maryland is one organization you might consider.
Yeah. I'd like you to address two things. First is the American founding, the Constitution and so forth, and the attitudes of the American founders, and whether those attitudes, whether the system that you have critiqued actually is consistent with the intent of the American founders. And the second question I'd like you to address is the extent to which what you have described, the system you have described, is really a bipartisan system where Ms. Clinton, for example, six-figure secret speeches to Wall Street, and on the list goes. I won't belabor you. And whether perhaps instead allowing Americans on a national level to have referendum or citizen-initiated ballot measures might be a part of the solution.
Well, on the last point, maybe you're right, but I think that there are so many immediate steps we have to take to remove the power of, such as public financing for and automatic voter registration, so more people are voting. Ranked choice voting is another reform that has a lot of support now. So I think that people have become so disengaged that to push something as big a system change as you're talking about would require that a lot of re-engagement of people, a lot more people expressing their views and understanding what's at stake, and being able to pass the kinds of public financing that would allow, you know, like Seattle represents, or Connecticut or Maine, so that they could stand up to corporate money. So in order that something like that could ever happen, I can't evaluate it. But my emphasis is on what do we need to, what are the immediate things that have energy behind it that are moving forward, such as the kind of reforms that I mentioned. In terms of our founders' vision, first of all, I believe it was Jefferson said their legislators cannot invent too many ways to subdivide property. There wasn't this notion that somehow we would allow, great concentrations of capital. In fact, corporations were initially only to benefit the society, the building bridges and such, and they had very careful rules around them, and I believe they had lifespans. They weren't indefinite. They weren't immortal. So it was a very different world in which they lived, in which, there are a lot of different views of different founders, and of course, that there was profound racism even among, profound racism involved in it. But there was also, that Jefferson writes and other founders, the believing in the capacity of regular people to have control and to have a voice, and so that was part, I believe, that we're now losing because of the power of concentrated wealth, and so so much of what is defeating democracy today, I believe, is this relatively new. I think of Ronald Reagan and the magic of the market. This idea that the market is somehow just infallible, and that anything that tinkers with it, and so many people have bought into that view, and so I think that we have to be in all of our work increasing understanding of what I would call economic democracy, that we can have brilliant markets, much more open and fair and workable markets, if we didn't have this concentration of capital at the top. And I was in a region in Italy that 40% of the economy, it's one of the most prosperous regions in Europe, 40% of the economy is cooperatives. So I think we need to be putting forth, I'm off your question in a way, but I think there's so much we have to be doing to help people understand the way that money power is concentrated and infected our political system, and that there are reforms that we can do now. I guess that's my bottom line answer. But it's a lot packed into your question, so thank you so much for that.
So in my adolescence, there was a song that went, you have to accentuate the positive, don't mess with Mr. In-Between.
Right.
Now, I had the feeling that that was the fundamental message that you were conveying at a very high level. This is a Unitarian audience, a perfectly appropriate level for a Unitarian audience, but maybe not so much for others. Last night, I listened to Donald Trump, and as he castigated Nancy Pelosi and Maxine Waters, my mind went back to Franklin Roosevelt. Martin, Barton, and Fish, economic royalists, attacking on the negative. When I went to bed last night, I was thinking, don't know why there's no sun up in the sky, Stormy Daniels. I wonder if it's not important also to communicate to a very large number of people who would go to sleep in this lecture in a way that makes a point.
Okay. Well, I'm glad I had the audience I did then. We have to, but I think that people are motivated by both, and that by pointing out the actual progress people are making, I think that is essential to the solutions. And the beautiful thing about the democracy movement is that it is attracting a lot of young people, and it's attracting a lot of labor, and so we're hoping very much that it can go beyond the our demographic here. So I don't know exactly how to answer your question, but the theme of my life is to share stories of possibility without ignoring the depth of the problem. And so I try to do both in this talk. And so it's like, back and forth between, okay, get serious about how bad it is, and yet it's possible. And often, so I don't know the answer to your question, but it's the question.
Thank you for being here. In my experience, democracy most benefits people who look like me, white and male. And so how, in a world where we've moved towards greater democracy here in America, based off your vision, how do we ensure that that democracy doesn't become rule of the majority and still protects rights of those not in the majority?
Yeah, I mean, I think that tenet of minority rights is foundational to democracy. And I also think that we have to create, right now, we don't have the conditions that enable us to discuss, we don't have, because I keep repeating myself, but I do believe it's true, there's so much dominance of democracy, what we're calling our democracy, by private wealth, that conversation about how do we do justice to minority rights, it gets lost in this vast assault by the minority of wealthy, So yes, the minority rights are very strongly protected for those who have the wealth. So I really don't have an answer other than the kinds of reforms that we see. Like I said, actually knowing that that we're doing much worse than other countries, when I flipped it in my head, it was really encouraging because, as I said, if I thought that we were really respectable level, and we have all this suffering, that would be even more discouraging. So I think there are lessons we can learn from other countries that do, that even Costa Rica, has kept corporate and big money out of their system, so they rank up very, very near the top with European countries. So there are very, very important things that we can do now. That's really the heart of my talk. So I feel like I'm not answering your question though. Do you want to push back at me to get me to answer it? Because I feel like...
I'm just maybe mindful of time. So
what?
We can talk later.
Okay.
Be mindful of time.
Yeah, I'm here. And I'm also very easy to find online. It's a Small Planet Institute. And I'll be back there with books too.
I guess my question is to ask you to comment on my answer to Duncan Ferguson, who asked the first question about where do we go from here. I think one thing is we refuse to be an enemy. And for 5 or 6 years, I've just decided that talking politics, even with Unitarians, is a waste of time. And certainly with people we disagree with. So what else, where do we go from there? And my thinking, George Lakoff, moral politics, has helped me understand that people that we frequently call stupid vote against their own economic interests because of their moral system. And that has to be respected. And I think about my high school classmates from Eastern North Carolina who switched from Democrat to Republican. How do I talk to them? And I know them as good people who have values, and if you're in their family, if you're in their tribe, their values are not that far. They're very empathetic. And so one of the questions is who's in and who's out. So somehow we have to raise the level of dialogue up to a really deep discussion about what does a civilized world look like, and find coalitions of people that have different issues but have similar values. So.
But
does that make sense?
Yeah, but that, to me, that's what the democracy movement stands for. That to come together, we can disagree on that particular, but come together on the fundamentals that we should all have a voice, and that we don't have in the current system. We're being drowned out, and that brings us together because, at least on the march, and we didn't agree on every issue, certainly, but on democracy reforms we do.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And just last week I finished William Barber's Third Reconstruction. And he talks about their success being based just like your democracy coalition building. They had 10 years of getting to know each other and agreeing they have separate issues, but they found out that they had similar people stopping them from doing what they wanted. And
exactly. Exactly. And in our book, we have a chapter on that North Carolina, the Moral Mondays movement, that I think is really instructive at this idea of bringing people across issues together in very face-to-face. Yes, please.
I came across an article by Andrew Sullivan, the conservative thinker. I particularly appreciate his line of thinking, even if I don't always agree with him. The issue he was addressing, this was in the New York Magazine, was the tribalism that has, really not just crept into American society, but has become such an entrenched aspect of how we see ourselves and how we function these days. If I may, I just want to quote a short piece from that and invite your response to it. He wrote, "The project of American democracy to live beyond tribal identities, to construct a society based on the individual, to see ourselves as citizens of a people's republic, to place religion off limits, and even in recent years to embrace a multiracial and post-religious society was always an extremely precarious endeavor. It rested from the beginning on an 18th century hope that deep divides can be bridged by a culture of compromise, and that emotion can be defeated by reason. It failed once spectacularly in the most brutal civil war any Western democracy has experienced in modern times, and here we are in an equally tribal era with a deeply divisive president who is suddenly scrambling Washington's political alignments, about to find out if we can prevent it from failing again."
Well, I as you could tell, I really push back, because that, when I hear that, it makes me feel that somehow there was something inevitable in the American genome that has led to this, and I just don't believe that. If you look at there's a book called Democracy in America ? With a graph in it, and it shows this is calculated over with a lot of different policy positions, etc., showing how the Republican Party and the Democratic Party has veered from their baseline sort of approaches, and you see the Republican line going way more to the extreme. And what I'm suggesting here is that there's nothing inevitable or natural or just American about that there's been a very deliberate attempt to turn us against the government as something that is our instrument for the common good and any notion of a common good, and that's been very deliberate. And so that I think that what I want to do is engage in conversations that take us beneath these trigger points and down to, what kind of society do we want, and what do you want for your children, and things like, I don't want my children to be burdened by debt all their life so they don't even have money to have kids, and how do we work on that? I don't want our babies to be, half of our newborns to be dependent on public aid. How do we deal with poverty? How do we, and the majority of us are concerned about climate change too, so I think I really resist and really react pretty negatively to these big sweeping generalizations about tribalism and polarization. We have been polarized. Polarization is a symptom, not a cause, in my view. And we really have to push back against that.
So how do we, see, that's the thing I struggle with. How do we not only counter that way of, generalizing and continuing to perpetuate that kind of thinking?
Well, just challenge it, write a letter to Sullivan. And any way that we can to push back, to say, wait, because we hear it all the time. I hear it all the time, and I'm working on it. But I think it's the challenge now, and I'd love to talk to you more about it, because it's exactly where I want to go, and we can talk.
Thank you.
I think we're all going to want to talk a lot more about what we've heard today, but we do have a lovely reception set up in the back. We have a book sale and book signing that's going to go on. So we'll end this part of it now and head for the fellowship hall. I want to thank, I will let you say one more thing. And I want to thank especially those who helped with this day, but I really want to thank Frances Moore Lappé.
I just can't overstate how welcomed I felt, how appreciated when I got here, and helped at every turn. And I feel that my parents would be ecstatic in this moment. And I just am so glad to feel connected. I want to stay connected. So thank you, thank you.